When the Twin Towers collapsed on September 11, 2001, Americans were still paralyzed by the shock of those horrific images. They had not yet processed what had happened. But just a week after that tragedy, ordinary-looking envelopes began arriving at specific addresses. White, mundane, regular postmarked envelopes. Inside was a piece of paper, and nestled within its folds, a fine, dry, white powder. At first glance, it looked like powdered sugar, but that powder was potent enough to enter your lungs with a single breath and end your life within days. This is how America's second nightmare after the Twin Towers began. On September 18, 2001, exactly 7 days after the Twin Towers fell, someone quietly dropped several envelopes into a public mailbox in Trenton, New Jersey. The addresses on the envelopes were written by hand. The handwriting was childish, somewhat large, and distorted. Postal workers wouldn't give these envelopes a second look among hundreds of millions of other letters. After all, millions of envelopes were shipped across the country every single day. But 5 specific envelopes were headed straight for NBC, CBS, ABC, the New York Post, and AMI, American Media Incorporated, located in Boca Raton, Florida. These were major news networks and newspaper addresses. The sender's target was clearly the media companies, and the words written on the papers inside were not ordinary things. September 11, 2001. The date of the attacks, written in the American format. Then it read, "Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great." The word penicillin was misspelled. Whether this was done intentionally or out of pure ignorance was completely unclear at the beginning. Curiously, the envelopes also contained that white, powder-like substance, Bacillus anthracus. Of course, we need to look closely at that first. Bacillus anthracus is a bacterium typically found in grazing animals like cattle, sheep, and goats, and it transmits from them to humans. The infected meat stories we occasionally hear about is exactly this. It is a disease known for centuries, but this bacterium possesses a specific trait that transforms it from a simple microbe into an absolute monster, the spores. When this bacterium sees bad environmental conditions, it encloses itself in a rigid shell and goes into hibernation. It can remain alive in the soil for decades, even centuries. It resists heat, cold, drought, and light. And the moment you inhale that spore, it enters the warm, humid environment of your lungs, finds an ideal environment, and wakes up, instantly begins to multiply, and starts destroying your body from the inside out. There are 3 forms of this infection. Cutaneous through skin contact, which is the mildest form, gastrointestinal, which is moderately severe, and the ultimate killer, the one that enters the lungs, the inhalation form. Left untreated, the mortality rate for inhaled Bacillus anthracus skyrocketed to 85 to 90%. A single breath could become your death warrant. Worst of all, the early symptoms mimic a common flu. But within 4 to 6 days, it takes a person straight to the grave. Just when the patient thinks they are recovering during a brief 2 to 3 day window, the body suddenly collapses. Respiratory failure, brain hemorrhaging, and shock follow. Beyond that, it had another terrifying characteristic, its potential as a biological weapon. This was a pathogen that served as the primary hero of secret biological warfare programs run by governments in their hidden laboratories. Yet, in the autumn of 2001, for weeks after the letters were mailed, no one realized what was happening. Because when the envelopes were opened, the fine powder dispersed into the air, settling on faces, hands, desks, and inside air conditioning vents, and then everyone simply went home. The microscopic spores multiplied silently during their incubation period. Until the symptoms appeared, nobody even knew they were sick. The first warning sign came from Boca Raton, Florida, from 63-year-old Robert Stevens. Stevens was a photo editor at AMI American Media. He was an expert in his field, widely loved, and a father of 3 children. In early October, Robert suddenly started feeling fatigued. He had a fever, his muscles ached. At first, he dismissed it as a simple flu and didn't care much. But upon returning home from a trip, his condition worsened drastically. Dizziness and nausea set in, and on the morning of October 2nd, he was found unconscious in his home. When he was rushed to the hospital, the doctors were baffled. They detected a rare microbe in his cerebrospinal fluid, something virtually unheard of in modern medicine. The last inhalation case in the United States had been recorded back in 1976. It hadn't been seen in nearly 25 years. Despite every medical effort, Robert Stevens passed away on October 5, 2001. He was the first human in a quarter of a century on U.S. soil to die from inhaling Bacillus anthracis. Panicked Florida health officials launched an investigation and discovered the lethal spores in the mailroom and air ducts of the AMI building. The source was undeniable. Someone had weaponized the mail. Authorities initially tried to downplay the situation with "don't panic" statements, but later, reality quickly tore through that facade. Around the same time in New York City, something was going terribly wrong at the NBC News headquarters. Erin O'Connor, an assistant to the famous news anchor Tom Brokaw, had been complaining for weeks about strange lesions forming on her neck and arms. When she went to the doctor, they initially called it an insect bite, then a skin infection. Those wounds had a dark, charred, coal-like appearance. Erin had contracted the cutaneous form of the infection. The culprit? A white powder she noticed weeks prior while opening Tom Brokaw's mail. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She had simply brushed it off her clothes with her hands and thrown the envelope in the trash. But the spores had already clung to her neck and arms. Soon, it became clear that the contagion was spreading to ABC News' Washington bureau as well. A producer's 7-month-old baby, brought to the studio for a single day, contracted the skin infection. Not even a 7-month-old infant could escape this malice. At CBS News, one of the assistants fell ill. At the New York Post, several newspaper employees showed symptoms. Someone had systematically targeted the country's largest media hubs in late September, and now people were dying. On October 9, 2001, just 4 days after Robert Stevens' death, 2 more envelopes were dropped into the exact same mailbox in Trenton, New Jersey. But this time, the target wasn't the media, it was the United States Senate. When an assistant tore an envelope open, a fine white powder vanished into the air. The building was evacuated immediately, but the damage was done. Hundreds of people had already been exposed to the spores. Furthermore, the spores in this second wave were technically far more refined and far more lethal than the first. When experts looked through their microscopes, they were stunned. While the first batch consisted of clumped, coarse powder, the spores sent to the Senate were as fine as flour. They had been meticulously engineered to remain suspended in the air for extended periods. They had been weaponized. This meant the perpetrator wasn't just mailing crude microbes, they were manufacturing a first-class biological weapon. Up until that point, given the timing just a week after 9/11 and the rhetoric in the letters, everyone assumed this was an Al-Qaeda operation, an external terrorist attack. But when that highly sophisticated, pristine powder from the Senate letters was analyzed, authorities realized that the knowledge, equipment, and materials required to produce it existed in only a handful of laboratories worldwide, and one of them was America's own biological defense facility in Maryland, USAMRIID, better known as Fort Detrick. The Senate building was sealed, and members of Congress were hastily put on the antibiotic Cipro. In the following days, the drug was heavily praised, triggering nationwide panics, an antibiotic shortage, and a massive run on gas masks. But while politicians had instant access to medication, the real tragedy was unfolding along the path. The letters traveled the ordinary postal workers. The letters destined for Washington, D.C. had passed through the massive Brentwood postal facility. As sorting machines processed the envelopes at high speeds, the immense pressure forced the microscopic spores to leak through the paper edges, contaminating the machinery and the air. Postal workers handled thousands of letters a day without masks or proper gloves. They were repeatedly assured by management that there was no danger. Thomas Morris Jr., 55, and Joseph Cursine Jr. 47 were dedicated employees at Brentwood for years. They had families, children, and normal lives. On October 21st and 22nd, respectively, both men died from the inhalation form of the disease. Two innocent workers, two human beings killed by letters they didn't even know they were carrying. The FBI and the police scoured the country for leads, but the anomalies kept mounting. On October 31st, Kathy Nguyen, a 61-year-old Vietnamese immigrant living in New York, died from the infection. She lived alone, had no connection to the media, took the subway to go home, and didn't receive unusual mail. Yet the spores found her. Weeks later, a 94-year-old woman in Connecticut passed away from the same cause. She had no connections either. Her mail had likely just crossed paths with a contaminated letter inside a sorting facility. Imagine that losing your life simply because your mail sat next to the wrong envelope. It was a cruel and senseless assault. The final toll stood at 5 dead, 17 infected, and over 30,000 people at high risk. Buildings were locked down, postal hubs were closed, and suspect sites were decontaminated by special teams. The public was terrified. Any white powder, from spilled flour to drywall dust, triggered frantic 911 calls. The paranoia grew so intense that hoax threats became a trend leading to hundreds of arrests. No one knew what was happening, but everyone talked about these unsolved mail attacks. As I mentioned, the FBI pointed squarely at Al-Qaeda from the beginning. The phrases, "death to America," "death to Israel," mirrored radical rhetoric. But the investigation deepened, and they realized it wasn't so. First, the pathogen belonged to a highly specific genetic strain known as the Ames strain. Isolated from a cow in Texas in 1981, it happened to be the reference strain used in the United States' own biological weapons programs. Yes, I might have forgotten to tell you. Every strain has its own history, and signature science could trace its lineage. Second, the quality of the spores was elite. The Senate powder was so expertly processed that Al-Qaeda's crude desert setups couldn't have achieved it. The trail led straight back to Fort Detrick. The culprit was inside America. The enemy was inside the house. The deliberate misspellings and overt rhetoric were a smokescreen, an attempt to frame Islamic terrorists. The killer had access to the Ames strain, possessed advanced weaponization knowledge, and worked inside a high-security laboratory. The list of suspects shrank drastically. Soon, a name emerged. Dr. Stephen Hatfill. Stephen Hatfill was a 47-year-old physician and virology expert. He had previously worked in places like Zimbabwe and South Africa before returning to the U.S. and spending several years at Fort Detrick. His thesis focused on defense against biological weapons. He had even authored an academic paper calculating how an anthrax attack could be carried out via the mail. On top of all this, the FBI felt his profile fit the bill all too well. He had worked in the U.S. biodefense sector, possessed knowledge of anthrax, and lived in Maryland. It seemed like the perfect moment to zero in on him. FBI agents raided Hatfill's home multiple times, turning his belongings upside down. Helicopters hovered overhead and cameras swarmed his doorstep. Even when he went to the market, a pack of 10 reporters would trail him. Yet despite extensive searches and interrogations, no evidence was ever found to prove his guilt. There was nothing to link him to the crime other than the fact that his profile was a perfect match. Nevertheless, and despite the public and international scrutiny, he lost his job, was stripped of his university teaching position, and was abandoned by his girlfriend, all because he was branded the definite culprit. In short, Hatfill's world collapsed around him, even though not a single fingerprint of his was ever found in connection with the incident. But ultimately, there had to be a culprit, and for a culprit to be named as such, evidence was required. Thus, as no evidence was found against the initial suspect and profiles were scrutinized, a new match emerged. His name was Bruce Edwards Ivins. He was a 62-year-old microbiologist who, like the other, had dedicated years of his life to Fort Detrick. He was an expert in anthrax vaccine development and one of the most critical scientists in the U.S. anthrax program. Yet beyond the suitability of Ivans's scientific background, there existed a far darker world surrounding him, in stark contrast to the cheerful demeanor and history of Hatfill, who was well liked by his friends. Bruce Ivans was someone who had struggled with psychological issues since childhood. It would later come to light that his mother had treated him cruelly and that he had problems with his step-siblings. As an adult, he developed an obsessive attachment to a sorority called Kappa Kappa Gamma, essentially a social club for female students. He harbored a mix of love and hate toward this sorority. He would sneak into their houses and steal items. He was even caught once after sitting in his car for hours watching the home of a sorority member and stalking her. He was quite simply a creep. Come to think of it, under normal circumstances, he wasn't the type of person who would end up heading a biological weapons laboratory. But back in the 70s and 80s, security screenings in America weren't nearly as comprehensive. Moreover, despite being a creep, Ivans was professionally highly skilled. And, coincidentally, he was a partner in a venture trying to develop a patent for an anthrax vaccine. In short, if an anthrax outbreak occurred, the government might turn to his venture, and he could make a fortune. Consequently, by 2007, there was no profile that fit the bill better than his. Attention was bound to shift from Hatfill to him. Even more remarkably, analysis of the recovered anthrax powder revealed that the code on the test tube used to produce the anthrax matched the codes of the test tubes in Ivans's own laboratory. Indeed, given the highly sensitive nature of biological weapons investigations, every laboratory's test tubes bore specific tracking codes, codes that could be identified through chemical testing. Furthermore, it came to light that Ivans had worked extensive overtime, logging an extra 8 to 10 hours a day at the laboratory during the period when the letters were mailed. These details, which had long gone unnoticed while suspicion was focused on Hatfill but had only recently come to light, led to the conclusion that there was no need to look elsewhere for the culprit. What more could be needed? With motive, greed, psychological issues, and ample opportunity all present, the suspect was right there, and the time had come to move in. By 2008, just as the FBI was preparing to set out one morning to formally arrest Ivans, he was found dead in his home on the morning of July 29th, following a report from his wife. He had taken his own life with an overdose of pills, leaving behind a case that could never be fully resolved. For, despite his story appearing to fit the crime perfectly, the FBI would ultimately find neither fingerprints nor camera footage. Whether due to his professionalism or simply a lack of evidence, Ivans was nonetheless branded the culprit. The FBI was unwilling to admit to a second major blunder. According to an official statement issued in 2010, the person responsible for the 2001 anthrax attacks had finally been identified with certainty. But then again, as I said, even though everything pointed to him, there was no proof. After all, Hatfill could just as easily have been the culprit. In fact, after being cleared in 2008, he even received around $6 million in compensation for the way his life had been derailed. So if he was cleared, Ivans, had he lived, could have been cleared too, given the lack of evidence. Of course, his suicide made him appear more likely to be guilty. That's a different matter. That was the story. A madman, though his exact identity remained unknown, had produced a biological weapon and unleashed it across the country, causing innocent people to fall ill and die. No motive could justify such indiscriminate attacks. This was a weapon that could strike anyone claiming victims through mere contact or inhalation. That was all that was known, yet even a 7-month-old infant had been affected. Hundreds of agents had logged a total of 600,000 hours of work, and millions of dollars had been spent. Yet, no specific individual could be conclusively identified as the culprit based on the evidence. Hundreds of questions remained, and as always, it was the innocent who suffered the consequences of a madman, or madman's, actions. Yes, that's all from me this week. Be sure to write your thoughts in the comments. I hope you liked the video. If you did, remember that I did all this work on the channel, from research to editing, alone, and that these videos were made possible only thanks to your likes and comments. You can support me by subscribing to the channel. See you in the next stories.